Milwaukee. Tonight we have Jeanie Dean speaking on the inner earth of the Shambhala. The inner earth, or Shambhala, as called by the Tibetans, has been the Mount Everest of spiritual studies. This talk is a short tour through some of the key points of entry into that magical and elusive land within.
Okay, so tonight's talk is about the journey to find the inner earth and Shambhala as an example of that, and it's focusing on Antarctica. I'm not going to say much about the Arctic, which could be a whole evening itself. And this all came out of last year's talk on the Templars. And we looked at the secrets that they had been pursuing and the treasures. And I don't know exactly how it led me to look at this question of the inner earth. But as I started to work on this, it was eminently clear that that was one of the treasures of the Templars was maps. And so I brought a globe, and maps do figure into our discussion about Antarctica. And so I'll start out with, the material and talk about some geography and things, and look at facts that we know about it, and then we'll quickly go into some of those other portals. So one of the things that really came out too at the beginning of my research that perhaps triggered it is the year 2017. And we've had a couple geophysical years. 1957 was one that was focused on studying Antarctica, and I believe that this is actually another geophysical year, and they span like 50. It'll be 2017 to 18. But this year there was some incredible headlines about Antarctica, and we'll have to wait till the end. But I could probably begin with a quick tour of that. Vice President Biden was there in Australia last summer, and at this year, in December, January, the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church was there. They have a little church there, and that was accompanied by a meeting with the Pope in Cuba. It's the first time in 1,000 years those two roles have met in person. I mean, and had some sort of formal meeting. At the same time, some sort of artifact was mentioned in the news, CNN kind of sources, and the Russian freighter that was taking the patriarchs made a stop in Saudi Arabia before picking up the Russian patriarch. So some have suspected that something was given to them to take to Antarctica. So it gets very strange. And along with that, Buzz Aldrin, the 33 Mason moon landing astronaut, went there and came back. He had to be airlifted out, and said something to the effect of a terrible evil that is frightening to all. And then it was a tweet, and then he deleted the tweet. Who else was there? Along with that, President Obama was there last year in Australia, along with the head of the CIA the same day. They were in two different locales in that zone of the world. And on the day that Trump was nominated, Biden was there. And then on the day that Trump was elected, Kerry, the Secretary of State, was in Antarctica. And I've got a wonderful picture of him standing on a thing of ice, looking very noble. So these are just a few very unseemly kind of, this dash of these important people. And along with that, King Carlos of Spain, Prince Harry of England, and some other, in the last three years or so, have been making treks there. And that's given people pause. Why is that suddenly happening? But let's go forward and just begin with some sort of essential information about Antarctica. And that's a rather lovely shot of someone skiing and the reflected sun, and it does have an unusual light because of its location on the planet. And I actually corresponded with someone in Antarctica in the 80s, right when the internet was just becoming where you could do that and you joined discussion groups. And I had this telepathic experience with my communicant, my email partner, and I learned something about telepathy, but I won't get into that today. But it was very interesting. So this is a basic view of Antarctica on the map, and why I have two views is because normally this is the view that's most commonly represented, and there's a peninsula here, and this is right off the coast of Argentina. And now you can see here the Falkland Islands, and now it's apparent why they have such importance is that they are the closest, one of the closest points to Antarctica is the Falkland Islands right there. Normally, so this is considered the West. And so over here is Australia, which we consider to be in the east. But it's on the west side of the map. And there's some curious things then, and over here's Africa. So these are the nearest land to Antarctica. But in the east-west view, this is how it would look. So this is Australia, and then here's Africa, and there's South America. But normally Antarctica is represented like this 90% of the time now, some sort of convention, even though it's kind of flipped. And I did bring along the globe if you want to have a tactile experience of it. So I'm going to just let that circulate among you. And so continuing, here's some just comprehensive stuff. It's divided by the transatlantic mountains into east and west sections, the transantarctic mountains, excuse me, which are 2,000 miles long. And Antarctica has the highest elevation. It's the coldest, driest, windiest place on Earth. It's 5.4 square miles, million square miles. It's 1.5 times the area of the United States. And the coldest temperature recorded was at a place called Vostok, which is in the Russian sector, and that was in July of '83, and it was 89 below. It's considered to be a desert in some places where the amount of rainfall is less than 9 inches. And the maximum of ice is in September and minimum in February. And in terms of geography, again, the transatlantic mountains are important dividing and site. There's a couple seas, and there's concerns that some of these ice shelves, and we consider Antarctica to be this land of ice, and that ice provides 90% of the world's ice and 70% of the world's water. So it has some very important geographic features, and it is known for its catabolic snowstorms. And there's pictures where you might notice it.
What's a catabolic?
It's I didn't look it up, but it's big. It's like only in these really cold climates. Here's another view, and just in terms of places, so most of what is there is bases, and it's organized by a treaty, but this is considered the South Pole, and the United States has a permanent base there called the Amundsen Scott base, based on the 2 different explorers who got to the South Pole within weeks of each other in the turn of the century. And here's McMurdo down here, which is another popular spot for, and here's a Scott base, and we have some bases over here. We hear about the Ross Ice Shelf. That was where the ice broke off this summer, if you heard about that. And there's different ice shelves throughout. This is Getz. This is the Bellingham Sea, the Southern Ocean, the Waddell Sea, King Haakon Sea. This area here, Queen Maud Land, is associated with Germans and Norwegian interest. And here's Neumayer, or there was New Schwaben land in the World War II era. Here's the French. Most of the individual places are named after explorers, but the big lands are named after the lords and ladies of the royal houses. So it's a land of ice, 148 square miles, I mentioned that 90% of the fresh water. And it's a huge sheet of ice over major landmass, especially in the west. Well, rather in the east is mostly land under it, and the west is appearing to be where some of it would be sea level. With no ice, half of Antarctica would be underwater, and ice leaves by calving of icebergs where it starts to break off at the edges. Some of this is also up for speculation. We're learning so much how, we have official tracks on what things are. Here's just a nice picture of a gigantic glacier, and some of the ice is a mile to 2 miles thick. So it's quite a ways to go before we see the land underneath. But it's also been reported by people of a giant oasis around the center. I don't know if I'm repeating myself here. This is the official South Pole, and it's marked by a compass there and one of our bases, and there's this famous globe as a sculpture there. But there's the geographic South Pole, whose axis is directly opposite the North Pole, and then there's a magnetic South Pole, which is related to where a line of magnetic field cuts off from the surface of the planet. And I'm not a great geographer, so I'll just kind of skip the details on that. Time in the South Pole is interesting. The sun rises and sets once a year, and its time is calculated by longitude, so radiating from the 0 point are all the latitudes. When the sun is right overhead, it's noon, and that also only happens once a year, because it's a land of 6-month summer and a 6-month winter. So it's very dark in the winter months. In the summer, the sun is above the horizon 24 hours a day, and in the winter, it's below the horizon. And there's where we get the one sunrise and the one sunset at the equinoxes. And people who research and do work there use their preferred time zone, because all time zones are emanating off from that 0 point. So that makes life interesting, I guess. And the exact location of the South Pole shifts because of platonics, or there may be some other reason. And so the South Pole is a 90-degree latitude and a 0-degree latitude. It's 90 degrees south, excuse me, which means going from the equator all the way down. It's 90 south, and then the 0 point. And all longitude meets at the poles. And at the South Pole, all directions are north, which is kind of what that business of how you can flip the map and it's still correct. And, here's a little bit on the Antarctic Treaty System. That is the emblem of the treaty. And there's the South Pole with the globe and all the flags there. And this is the United Nations of the South Pole. And it's established a treaty system that was set up in the 50s and was re-established in the 90s. But there are 12 governing countries, 38 have joined since the original 12. And it prohibits military activity and mining, or even trading, except for, low level. And then it also prohibits nuclear waste. And the point is for scientific research. And that's been working. So basically you can't go to the South Pole. There are tourist ships and such. They really don't let you step out too much. There's islands around that often you can go and do some touristing or hiking or skiing for a day. But for the most part, it's very hard to get on this planet, onto this place. It's one of the most exclusive spots on the planet. Here's a geographic map. And so, so we know the United States is over here in the peninsula. The UK is up here. Norway has a very big chunk because they were the first to land. Coming around on that side, let me see here, is Australia when they have a very big chunk. And then France has a piece and more Australia here. This is Wilkes Land. Wilkes was one of the major explorers. Queen Maud Land is in Norway. And then over here is New Zealand. And then this is sort of undifferentiated territory. And a couple of countries have the option to make a claim but haven't, like Russia. They're not listed there. And so they still have a presence, but they don't officially have a claim. Anyway, going on forward, inhabitants. This is the people of the Australia contingent, and they really seem to live there. This is just a photo of somebody, a Chinese wedding. They must have had a lot of money to get that. And a researcher, another researcher, and there's a team at a base playing soccer. And so the temporary population is considered to be about 5,000. And then in the winter, when people leave because it's cold and dark, it's about 1,200. My own intuition suggests those numbers they've been the same in several years. I've looked at different sources, that there's actually more bases that are occupied, because there's quite a few bases there. There are 30 countries with 80 bases. And so the most are US, British, Argentine, Czech. And so there have been 10 births since 1940. And then this is a map showing bases. So all those stars, there's quite a few, and of course it makes sense, you come in on a ship and the coast is where the bases have been erected. And not much in the interior. And wildlife. There's mostly it's marine wildlife. There's very few vertebrates. And seals, walruses, petras. The white birds are petras. That's an albatross up on the left. And then there's mites. So here's a picture of a mite down there, right there. And lichen and moss are very big life forms in Antarctica. So there's quite a bit of that, and algae and plankton. And since the, somewhere recently, I think it was 94, no animals can be there. So in the early days of exploration, I was bringing guard dogs and different animals even to sort of harvest, but that's not allowed anymore. And the penguins are such a part of it, I just had to do a page on the penguins. So these are the ones that are called the rock hopper, with the great eyes. And these are the Adelaide. Oh, they're so cute, look at that. And these are called the chin strap ones. And the ones with the golden necks are the emperor. And then those are the gento. So those are some of the main breeds. And along with penguins, there are a lot of polar creatures that actually go back and forth between the North and South Pole. And it's a migration of 7,500 miles that they go. Some of those would be birds, things like albatross. Okay, so then lakes and mountains. Lake Vostok is the most famous, and it's below the ice, but they know it's there. They've been drilling 1,300 feet. We keep hearing about these Russian drills, and they've been very active doing that. There's 2 active volcanoes. There are, in recent studies, they found different numbers, 70 to 90 subglacial volcanoes. Boy, that thing changed and I didn't ask it to. I don't know why it did. We'll probably, and here's some great pictures. This is Mount Erebus, the tallest volcano. And this is a volcano on one of the islands off the coast. And it's got a warm, fresh, it's a lake that is so warm from the volcanic heat. And it's completely cold around it. So that's a tourist spot. Doesn't that sound like it'd be
Let's go.
But
They
Yeah.
call it Deception Island.
Yeah, I don't know why. I think that was one of the ships from Captain Cook, perhaps. And here's some more pictures of topography and this mountain region, and then these large shelves of ice on the coast. I mean, it is stunningly magnificent. So more topography, Mount Erebus, which we just saw. The Vinson Massif is the highest peak. It's another mountain. The volcanoes on Deception Island. And recently about 70 volcanoes have been found. And then they found all these lakes under the ice. The whole idea of all this landform and life form under the ice is just mind-boggling, really. And that's the nature of things there, which leads to some of these speculations and inquiries of other life and other structures that have been eking out through the press. And so here's a breakdown. There's 3 main ice sheets: the west, the Antarctic Peninsula, and the east. And this is a breakdown of how and what they are. Most of them are between 1 and 2 miles. The coast, they're thinner. They're obviously thicker inland. If they were to fully melt, it would be 58 meters of sea level, which is a lot. And I always think in feet. I'm a British measuring system, so, but some substantial changes would affect the entire planet. Here's another picture of an ice shelf. And this is something that keeps coming up, that they're discovering as the ice shelves are actually breaking up, that there's a whole terrain underneath, especially on the west. And along with that, they're finding ancient, like several million years old, ancient or tens of thousands of year old structures and signs of intelligent life. And that's sort of the big million-dollar question about what's going on with Antarctica. More on icebergs. I guess I went overboard. But these are the main ice shelves through here that are starting to melt and break away. So up north and in this Ross area. Okay. Places of interest. This is the Wilson Center, it's called. Like we have that in Milwaukee, don't we? And one of them is the Amundsen Scott Base. And it used to be under a geodesic dome, and they rebuilt this over a period of 5 years. And it's a series of buildings, and they're all on stilts. And it has a nuclear power generator, and it's quite a sophisticated place. And
almost to say, screw you, Buckminster Fuller.
well, it got old, and snow is a big management problem, and so this building is set up where they can really manage.
Using nuclear power.
Yeah, And then some other places are, this is the Shackleton's shack, if you will, from when he was an explorer, one of the first ones. And he built a base, and so it's still there, and they've kept it up. And then the other one is Scott's Base. We'll learn a little bit more about him. And then this is a place in the peninsula called the Lemire Channel, and it's these 2 ice walls, and it's just considered very beautiful. And so the cruise ships go through there. A nice picture on a little poem somebody wrote. Everything exerts its own gravitational pull. The tide is rising, you know, wolves are howling, deep ocean under icy crust. So I'll just leave it with that. So explorers have been a big part of the Antarctica story. And this is an interesting map that is a teaser for more to come. But these are actually two maps from 100 years apart from Muslim map makers. And they both show the Earth with a hollow opening at the top. And this idea that there was an Earth inside the Earth. And one of the issues that's been evolving is if you go under this shelf of ice, there's signs of life there, and then what was that life? And is that this land called Shambhala that is talked about in the lore of the Tibetans and other names from other traditions. Here's another antique map from 1906. So quickly going through that, I guess I can try to go back to that page. There was Captain Cook, remember the Captain Cook pirate guy?
Did you mention the Piri Reis map?
We're almost, yeah, we're a few minutes away from that. So, so Captain Cook was one of the first explorers to have made his way to Antarctica, and he's tied in with being a former Knight Templar, or you know, a later generation Knight Templar, having access to Templar maps. So here's where we see this Templar tradition kind of overlapping into the Antarctica story in the 21st century. The first Russian to see Antarctica is von Bellingshausen and Mikhail Lazarev, and their ship is Vostok and Mirny. Vostok means east and Mirny is peaceful, so there's quite a few places there named after the Vostok. The next was American in 1820, Edward Bransfield. It's interesting how these were all within months of each other. Nathaniel Palmer, a sealer, and then in 1821, the first landing by a U.S. person was at a place called Hughes Bay, and then the French landed at Adelaide Land in the 1840s, and by that time the United States is doing a big expedition called XX, and that was in 1840 that they made a landing. This is a great picture of a katabatic wind. And it's interesting, I mean, whenever, there's pictures from this time, and it just looks like sheer travail, you know, just unbelievable work just to stand there and breathe. And now people go down there and they're wearing their little red, you know, Gore-Tex jackets with a little plastic fur around it, and they seem fine. But anyway, it's a classic picture from an expedition in the 20s. Continuing with explorations, you heard about the Ross Shelf, and that was Captain Ross, a real intrepid traveler to Antarctica. Mercator Cooper, and here's Shackleton's expedition in 1907, and he led quite a few. And he never made it to the South Pole, but he did climb Mount Erebus, and he did reach the magnetic South Pole. And so his shack is still preserved, and he's definitely an important figure. And he made it to these other places. And then a few years later, the actual first landing at the South Pole was by the Norwegian Amundsen, and then Scott was a few weeks later, and his expedition actually died. They did not make it home, but they did make it to the South Pole, so we use both their names. And Richard Byrd then in the 30s ends up flying and having a very important part of the Antarctica story, and I don't even fully have it, but he's a very significant player. The first woman was Caroline Michelson, and another Ingrid Christensen in the 30s. So here's some pictures of Shackleton, and I mean, just look at how grizzled those fellows look. They've been there. I mean, they're completely snow burned, and it's not an easy. And this is the kind of ships that they were riding in to get to the coast. And so this was his team, and this was the trek he took coming in this way, and then heading towards the pole, trying to get there. And he didn't make it, but he went to some other sites. And that's, you know, he looks like a pretty strong-minded person. In terms of the Scott story, Scott and Amundsen, Scott was a Terra Nova, and he hired a lot of scientists, tourist patrons, so you know, it's like, holy ho, let's go down to the Antarctica. And Amundsen was much more professional about it, and he at one point sends a telegram to Scott saying, beg leave to inform you, Fram, which is the name of his ship, and proceeding to Antarctica. And his claim, he also was the first to reach the North Pole, but then it was lost, but then they reinstated it. So he was a true intrepid. And so Terra Nova and Fram arrived in Antarctica in January, which is summer, and they camp 400 miles apart, set up supply depots. And Scott takes Shackleton's route, and he's got a lot of gear, ponies and dogs and motors, and they all fail. It comes down to 4 who do make it to the South Pole. And Amundsen, who is a Norwegian, he brings dog sleds, and he wears gear like he's going to be in the cold, and they take a much more efficient route, and he gets there within a short number of weeks and sets up a camp, and his whole crew, they all return. And then Scott arrives a month later and finds gear and food and a note, you know, if we die, give this to the King of Norway. But Scott's team, they die from frostbite and starvation 11 miles from the supply depot. So that's a very tragic end for them. But you know, this determination and this rush, you know, this to be the first and to conquer this unknown land, that was part of the 20th century quest. And so anyway, then Richard Byrd later on follows in 26. He's the first one to fly over the South Pole, and eventually helps establish the station there. And here's a picture of Scott. He's British, and they talk about how he was all very orderly and military, but in some ways it didn't help. But there they are with all their gear and coming in on the ship, and there were some of the ponies they brought, and that's his shack. And this was Amundsen, and he's dressed up like a polar bear. And they're a similar route. They're coming in from a ship, and they're bringing their gear on sleds. And they have these tiny little tents, and studying maps. So, and this was a photo somewhere of, you know, the kind of stuff that Scott had at his base. They brought the comforts of home, you know. So anyway, so ancient maps. You were asking about Piri-Reis. So that was sort of the 20th century basic storyline. But if we look, there's a whole other story that goes way back. And Hapgood is a 20th century scholar, and he has a book called Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. And it's based on researching copies of maps that were charted and transferred between Alexandria and Egypt to Constantinople. And around the 1200s, during the Fourth Crusade, the Venetians of Italy get control of some of this map collection, and these maps start circulating in the West in the medieval era. And Medici obtained several important ones, and you know, like, I mean, this idea we want to know the secrets of the world, that, you know, that was the whole quest for Columbus and all of that. But so the Templars play into this, and it seems that one of the treasures that they got was some of this knowledge of these maps. And what they show is very important. Many of them are just Mediterranean type stuff, but others show America, the Arctic, and the Antarctic. And there's evidence of ancient voyagers traveling from pole to pole. Some ancients explored Antarctica when it was ice-free. Ancient navigation instruments accurately determined longitude superior to ancient, medieval, or modern method until the 19th century.
Which, when it was ice-free, it was millions of years ago.
Exactly.
And the poles were in completely different areas.
Right, and so this is what Hapgood is reconstructing from. He's studying this particular map collection, and it's in this book. And he says there's evidence of a lost technology that supports and gives credence to a hypothesis of a lost civilization in remote times, possibly at Antarctica. And he even proposes that Atlanta could have been at Antarctica, and that it was destroyed by crustal displacement. But there's a new theory that's saying maybe the poles didn't shift. And I'll just tell it to you right now that we all know from the work of Zecharia Sitchin that, and we know about the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, that there was this planet called Tiamat. And that at some point Tiamat was destroyed. And there was, believed through a cosmic war between warring extraterrestrials. And they used ultimate force and caused Tiamat to blow up. And let me finish and then, and so the asteroid belt is the result of this blowing up of Tiamat. And part of it was thrown out into the galaxy and such, and we still have asteroids falling. But the theory is that that explosion caused such a rift in the whole solar system that it penetrated into our ionosphere and caused a short period of time a wound, a hole in our ionosphere, and that the air in space is ice cold, and that this caused this flooding in of this ice cold atmosphere into our atmosphere, and at the point where the point where this line was at Antarctica, and that caused this flash freezing that is seemingly what's happened. That, I mean, there's this lush land underneath, and then they're finding artifacts that are completely intact, and they're saying this was flash frozen. This did not happen gradually the way an ice age would be, like over a period of months and years. This was like instant. So that's one idea, that the poles didn't shift, but that there was this catastrophe in our solar system caused a big change on the planet. What were you going to say?
I'm going to have to look up the information and send it to you, but
Sure.
Very respectable scientific communities cite sources in research that has been done, chemical analysis of layers of sediment, soil, and also in the Arctic layers of ice that have proven one way or another and determined precisely where the poles were previously, and they've determined scientifically multiple polar shifts. They found that at one point in time the North or South Pole was near Hawaii, and that's only one of the discoveries.
And that's a huge focus. I wasn't able to go far into it, and it is a plausible explanation for what happened. And I presented the other one as some new thinking, assessing it. They mentioned that there's some very, I forget it, mineral content that's known to be on Mars at Antarctica, and they haven't found it anywhere else on the planet too. So the Piri-Reis map, which you had asked about, was found in 1929 in a palace in Istanbul, and it was made by this Turkish map maker, and he used the resources at the Imperial Library, and it has an accurate west coast of Europe, North Africa, Brazil, and the Atlantic coast, and Antarctica.
And that's one of the ones that's based off of the Alexandrian.
Exactly. Yep.
Very ancient.
And he claims to have, and this map is noted, and it's a collection of maps really, but that he had maps from Christopher Columbus, And he even had maps from the time of Alexander the Great, which would have been 400 BC. And it kind of is a summary of the knowledge of things in the 1500s. Here's what it looks like. We only have a fragment of it, but this area here, I don't know why I did that, I'm sorry. I just have to go back. Is the coast of South America, kind of in a reverse, if you will. But then we don't have the, I mean, we could spend a whole hour just on that. But there are puzzling things about this map, that it's accurate 300 years before Antarctica was even known about. And it shows Queen Maud Land, the coast and rivers, which are all under ice. It shows them without ice. And the recent geology has proven that the accuracy of what's here. And Hapgood, who wrote The Sea Kings, said the mathematical probability is just astronomical. I mean, it cannot be explained by accident. This is a breakdown of some of the maps. This is the map that we've been looking at. And this one over here, A, is the Piri-Reis map showing how close it is.
Well, that's not the Piri-Reis map, but that's another
Oh, no, it's...
That's another pre-discovery map that's based on one of the more ancient maps.
This A map is it's a map of Terra Australia's from Piri-Reis.
Is there?
Yeah.
I never saw that depiction.
Yeah.
It looks like some of the other ones that I've seen.
And this is Atlantis is described in the 1890s, and then it kind of seems to look like Antarctica with its ice cap. So other maps, well, Hapgood looked at, well, how could they be so accurate? And they sent it to MIT people, and they said they were using spheroid trigonometry, which involves knowing the curvature of the Earth, how to project, and a high level of knowledge. So this is a French map called the Orontius Phineas world map from the period of Pierre Marquette in the 1700s. Again, extremely accurate, inexplicably so. And the Chinese map from, actually this was from a column and it was put on paper. Many common points with the West, and so Hapgood says there had to be a common source, a possible lost civilization. So this whole world of maps is again takes us back to the Templars, and may have been part of their treasure of knowledge, and is significant. And Hapgood did his work in the 70s, but this is what he says. It appears that accurate information has been passed down from people to people. The charts must have originated with a people unknown and were passed on perhaps by the Minoans or the Phoenicians, who were for 1,000 years the greatest sailors of the ancient world. We have evidence that maps were collected and studied in the Library of Alexandria, and the compilations of them were made by geographers who worked there. Piri-Reis probably had come into possession, once located, of maps in the Library of Alexandria, the most important library of the ancient times. So Hapgood is very convinced that there's this lineage, and again the Templars play into it. So this question of the maps and what's under the ice also has been, and so this prior civilization has opened up another inquiry about the inner Earth. And there's a lot of lore about the inner Earth. The Chaldeans have it, in the Hebrew, the primary Eden was considered to be the center of the earth. In Egypt, Tan-Eater is the land of the gods, is in the extreme north. And there's different variations on this, and one of the things is to be avoided is conflating it all, but sometimes that seems to happen in our instant world. But the Iranians and the Indians all have literature referring to the center of the earth. In Japan, the world is held together by a pole from the center of the earth. Chinese have a round paradise in the center. The Eskimos say they came from a land of perpetual sunshine in the north. The Greek idea of the navel of the earth. Orpheus goes to the center of the earth. The Hindu Karmu has a picture of a land with Mount Meru where a great yogi lives, the center of the earth. The Gnostics had an idea of a land north lit from within. We have Santa Claus, and you know, and then the Himalayan and the Tibetans talk about Mount Meru and Shambhala, and they're different things. We have the land of that Gilgamesh went to in his myth. Sometimes it's called the land of 100 names, and navel of the world, Agartha, the inner earth, the pure land, the place of no want, the land that never perishes, even the Greek Hades, the Christian hell, and so on. So Shambhala turns up in the Tibetan sacred text as a place of peace or tranquility with a double T. And it's a mythical kingdom hidden behind the snow peaks, a place where the sacred Buddhist teachings and the Kala Chakra, Wheel of Time, are preserved. It's a land of 8 circular rings, which definitely makes me think of Atlantis. It is the navel of the planet, a prophecy of a future Shambhala king to come forth and free the world from barbarism and usher in a golden age. The Hindus have a similar prophecy in their Kalki Avatara, although the land is in a little different description than what's in the Tibetan. So there's many texts about this, and typically it's said that the land is only reached by an arduous journey across the wilderness, desert mountains, and reached by only those who are called and have the right heart and spiritual preparation, and others will find death and emptiness. Here's a Tibetan picture of Shambhala. So here's the Shambhala king, and then it's got 8 sections, so it's like an 8-petal lotus, and then these are these white peak mountains. And so this is Mount Meru is represented as being in the center, and I wish we had more time to give it the depth of question that it should have. This is a view of from the Hindu text of Mount Meru. It's a little different, and it's more of sort of a vertical process, which some say is like how the Earth is, that there's this vertical hollow portion through the middle that opens from the North Pole and the South Pole. So a lot of times when people hear about the inner Earth and this mystical land of tranquility and where life never perishes, say, how can I get there? So, and I don't know if I necessarily have an answer, but this was a group of climbers recently who got my attention. They climbed a place in the Himalayas called Shark's Fin, and it's part of the Meru mountain range that is between Pakistan and Tibet and the Himalayas. And it hasn't been climbed successfully by very many people in the West. And so here they are, a picture of the base camp, and these 3 climbers, they're Americans, and they stopped at this place with this guru guardian, so that before they climbed. And Conrad Anchors, this one, I think he's kind of well known. But I thought that was kind of interesting. So there's an example of that physical journey to that great holy place. And I'm just reinforcing the Shambhala warrior. And the time will come, some wonder if it's near, when the deterioration of mankind, barbarians rule the world, and there's nothing left to conquer. And the mist of earth will open and an army of Shambhala warriors appear to war between dark and light prevails, ushering a new age. And Dalai Lama said in '85 that only those with karmic connections can go to the Pure Land in the human realm, which is something that's repeated a lot in Tibetan text. There's an allegory to this, that there's an outer and an inner teaching, that only the pure of heart live there, and it's an allegory for self-realization. It's a hidden location. It's a place of no age or want. So when we do our practice and get beyond that, this outer place can be found by inner awareness. And that ushers that final golden age. Here's a picture from the Hindu view of Mount Meru. And they see there's this pole, and here are these 8 rings again, in a sort of a flat dimensional. Sorry about that. That's an interesting, it reminds me of a Native American view picture. And I think I just showed that. So there's some historic texts from Madame Blavatsky and Plato about this. And according to Tibetan tradition, the White Island is the only locale which escapes the fate of other dwapas and can be destroyed. She also says the mid-Atlantic continent runs 3,000 miles south. And she says Meru is not the fabulous mountain in the center of the earth, but its roots and foundation are in that navel. Plato talks about this place. He talks about Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules is an island larger than Libya. The Atlantean power subdued North Africa and Egypt, the preeminent race and leader of the Hellenes. He says a mysterious passageway in and around the Atlantean continent, tunnels both broad and narrow in the interior of the earth. And he describes a great ruler who sat at the navel of the earth. This idea of this narrow, these tunnels is also figures quite a bit in what's being talked about and discovered. In alchemy, there's this term, the vitriol, which is in Latin for visit the interior of the earth, and by rectification, you will find the hidden stone. So the interior terra, rectification, interior, and lapum. So that those points are represented here. So even alchemy was codifying the idea of an inner realm in the earth. Now if we look at modern or recent science, hollow earth theories are abundant. Edmund Halley's comet, great astronomer, postulated that the interior of the earth was hollow, and he said there were 4 orbs within each other. And he talked about a central sun, and the aurora borealis is the light coming out of the points at the top. Leonhard Euler, a Swiss mathematician, had a similar idea, but he only said there were 2 worlds. A famous army officer pursued that inquiry, and they called it Sim's Hole. Marshall Gardner, because a woolly mammoth was found, and he wrote a book called Journey to the Earth's Interior, and he focused on proofs, scientific evidence proving that the Earth that there was a hollow Earth or an inner Earth. There's also talk about a middle Earth. Cyrus Reed was a herbalist, and he wrote about this. These are all the 1800s, and his book was The Phantom of the Poles. I haven't read all of them. I've read one of them. Hollow Earth in Fiction. It's a 1700 novel, Neil Klim's Underground Travel. Casanova. He wrote 18,000 pages, or 1,800 pages on the inner earth. I had no idea. And his work was called Icosamaran. And it's about a brother and sister who fall into the interior, and they meet the Megamikers, a race of hermaphroditic dwarfs.
Multicolored.
And then there's Zibzonia, which is believed to be a pseudonym for Sim. Edgar Allan Poe wrote the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, which is about inner earth. And Jules Verne, Journey to the Center of the Earth. William R. Burroughs of Tarzan Fate wrote At the Earth's Core. James Hilton, Lost Horizon.
That's interesting. A lot of these fictional accounts often talk about giant crystals, everything much bigger. And only recently, I thought it was roughly 10,000 feet below a Mexican desert, was discovered.
Yes.
These enormous crystals that they're
75 feet long.
Right.
We're doing a work in Antarctica for the Nazi Navy, had an encounter, as did Admiral Byrd. This font isn't easy to read. The Hollow Earth, Enigma. There's a very interesting story by this Pratsman who was taken into an opening through a friend of his who was a Hopi Indian. A Christian, My Visit to the Sun. And these are not comprehensive in any way. There's a lot of accounts. In Brazil, there's many accounts of people having encounters to the inner earth. This is an interesting picture of a place that was only discovered not too long ago, near a place in Peru called the City of the Gods, but they just found this in a valley someplace, and they're calling it the portal to the City of the Gods. And it's not really a doorway. The doorway doesn't really go anywhere. So it's kind of like what you're talking about, one of those fifth dimensional places. This is a list of places that is, again, not comprehensive, that people are mentioning where portals are. New York City, the Church of St. John Divine, the Del Norte Mountain in Texas, the Hindu Kush Mountains of Afghanistan, several points in Brazil, Avalon, Glastonbury, the Stratford Hatch Tunnel, many sites in India. There's now, and there's sites being found in Turkey, these huge cave cities with giants, evidence of giants having lived there. And again, some of those tunnels and caves that are approached from our place, I think, are what are really considered Middle Earth. And that's something we may not have time to really fully sort out. But then there's this idea that Atlantis may have been at Antarctica. And again, there's this idea of a veil of secrecy, a lost pre-civilization, and how it became covered with ice and hidden for several thousand years, not millions, but thousands. This is a list of contemporary theories, which I won't take you all through. But these are contemporary writers in the last 50 years who are writing on Atlantis, and many of them with, I was going to mention Sir Edward Bolton. And here's another view of this idea of the hollow earth, or in the inner earth, and the two openings. I recently learned of a group called the Ocular Society, and they were a secret society for about 300 years. And if you look at, this is like an eyeball.
Mm-hmm.
And that Ocular Society may have been coding knowledge, this knowledge, in plain sight, you know, in the anatomy of the eye. But there's something to contemplate in that. And some of this is tied in with shifts in the poles and other kinds of lore. Here's another view of this idea of the central sun, and the idea of the inverted earth within and without. So here are some very interesting images of our planet through Google Earth. And there's an opening at the North Pole, and this is the South Pole. And these were from the 1960s, and primitive satellite technology. There's actually, so these are not, this one's Google Earth, but those are 60s. And there's pictures of Antarctica. They all have a little black hole at the center, like it's like a record. You know, that little hole in the record. Mm-hmm. And whatever's there, they're not showing it. Any NASA released pictures of Google Earth are pre-wiped. Go ahead.
I want to say that airplanes, it's illegal for airplanes to go over certain territories in the North and South Poles.
Right, yes.
And also, if you look at the circuits of the satellites, they sort of evade certain central regions. And NASA and Google and these organizations who provide the satellite imagery for the planet, they always will admit that the majority of what we see in these official presentations is sort of Photoshop, because they take little bits and pieces from here and there and then just kind of like a puzzle digitally re-image it.
And then there are these like hawks out there who are studying things and finding, you know, and they're indisputable, irrefutable when you know that happen to fall through the cracks and people are finding. This is the next piece is on 20th century exploration, and this is from Nicholas Rourke, who was a theosophist. Who we have some of his books in our library, but he was 60 years old. He did 2 treks, and his wife Helena translated Blavatsky's work into Russian, and they're very controversial. They're amazing and strange, but they did a trek to Tibet to find Shambhala. And and he was a painter. So this is one of his pieces. And here's some more. So the vision that he had was quite remarkable. So all contemplative, and the image of the Lama or the Bodhisattva in the mountain. And so here they are. I won't go through the whole life story, but Rourke did a couple things. He left Russia after the Russian Revolution, was very successful with his art in American and Britain, and then decided to go on this trek to Tibet, got funding somehow, and he's also known for kind of conflating Buddhist and Hindu and occult ideas and kind of mushing things up. And he also was apparently maybe an emissary of the Russian government, but the Tibetans were kind of interested in talking to him because they were getting oppressed by the Chinese, and so there was a political, and the same with Blavatsky. These two are from the same tradition. Anyway, they make this trek, and it's several years. But Rourke also, he built a museum in New York City that's a skyscraper that houses his work. He carried around this thing called a chinam for about 6 years. It was supposed to be a sacred talisman from some inner earth Tibetan holy man. And there was all this lore about that. He was able to get a thing called the Rourke Pact sign, which is to protect cultural objects, and that's been established since the 40s. You know, that cultural objects should not be destroyed during times of war. And he made this Pax Cultura, and it's like a Red Cross for museums and schools and such. And he was nominated 3 times for a Peace Prize, and he founded the Himalayan Institute. So quite a accomplished, intrepid person. They went for 3 years with his sons, and there they are, and some of the things that they experienced are unbelievable. At one point they were like held hostage, kind of, in some little village in the middle of a mountain pass, and then they couldn't go anywhere. They weren't allowed to leave. They were fed maybe. And he could always like trade paintings, and he was very good at calling favor, and they were very likable, and he was very optimistic. But when they finally got the passport, the snow came and they were still stuck there. You know, so it demanded, like what the Shambhala teachings say, you really have to have, you know, you'll experience a lot of struggle on the journey to find Shambhala, and they really did. So they had these incredible travails, and they did make various negotiations and exchanges. And his journal is in our library here, and probably his great testament is the paintings that he left, you know, and again the optimism that they exhibited through great hardships. And then he was friends with President Roosevelt, and then the United States funded another trip, and by this time they were well into their 60s or 70s, trekking through the mountains, and so they really did in a way play a very important role in bringing the East to the West in that time period in the 20s when there was that exchange going on. At some point in all of this place called Agartha becomes mixed with the lore, and some of the people I've researched point out Agartha never was a term used in Buddhist or Tibetan literature, but there's Asgard, the home of the Norse gods. So there's this kind of mishmash of where's Shambhala, where's Mount Meru, because some places say it's in the north, some places say it's in the east and the west, or in the center. But Agarte was originally introduced by a French writer, Louis Jacot, and then Saint Ida Alverde spread this legend even more. But that comes up to be a significant influence on the Nazis, this idea of Shambhala and Asgard being the same and part of their quest. This breaks down how Blavatsky looked at Shambhala, and this looks at how Steiner viewed it. And Steiner saw Shambhala and the lords of Shambhala as like Lucifer, and they all embrace this idea of Lucifer as a dualistic concept, reversing it. For Steiner, Lucifer is overcoming the debasement of Christianity, because he is a believer in Christ. Alice Bailey has also takes on this Luciferian idea, and so where there's this real mixing that's going on of occult ideas with this Tibetan Hindu idea of Shambhala and this inner earth that happens with this cross exchange of ideas in the east and west. And she's kind of interesting. The Lucius Trust is from her involvement with the Lucifer concept. Another important figure that's less known is Maurice Doreal, who comes out with the Brotherhood of the White Temple, describes Shambhala as a white temple in Tibet, 75 miles below the surface, which is kind of what we were saying earlier, that there's this place about 100 miles down. And that Shambhala has two halves. The south is where the Adepts are, and in the north is where Maitreya is. So he differentiates it a little bit more. He also is associated with the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, the Atlantean. And we did a class last semester on the Emerald Tablets, and so he's considered to be the translator. This is from Maurice Doreal. And he says they were found in the Great Pyramid, and that he was helped to channel the translation. Venus?
Well, I wanted to bring up.
We're running out of time.
Well, I mean, I'll just say really quickly, there's a lot of discussion right now about the archetype of Lucifer as it relates to Azazel in the...
We don't have time for it. We don't. Okay. We absolutely don't. Because it's all... And I wanted to mention that this idea of the Shambhala and the prophecy of Shambhala to come and the Shambhala warriors then has political elements. This particular monk is a Russian Mongol, and he was the Dalai Lama's, in his last incarnation, his debate master, a very significant figure, but he gets involved in promoting the Shambhala mythology to help foster Tibet's breaking away from the influence of China. And so he supports some of what Rourke is doing, and he convinces the Dalai Lama at that time to go and build a temple in St. Petersburg. And he convinces the Russian Tsars, Nicholas, I believe, to make this temple. So in the early 1900s, a temple, a Tibetan Buddhist temple is built in St. Petersburg. And Nicholas Rourke is involved with that project too. And then that leads him also to want to go climb the mountain. But an important part of the story. And then part of the lore continues through these other travelers, and this fellow here is Olsendowski, and he just looks like people I've met on the east side that aren't too aren't too trustworthy. But he looks like a real wild man, and he's known for, like, for instance, being teamed up with Baron Sternberg, who was against the communists and was a notoriously cruel warlord, but that between the two of them, he helped this Sternberg with the recipe for poison gas. So, but in both of these two accounts, one relating to Japan and one relating to the Mongols in the Russian Revolution, they were using the Shambhala myth to rally the troops, and that it's, you know, so these mythologies have that also, that power to be used politically. These are some things that Rourke said in his journal. In many places, they speak of Agarte, which isn't true, the subterranean people. In beautiful legends, they outline the same story of how the best people abandoned the treacherous earth and sought salvation in hidden countries where they acquired new forces and conquered powerful energies. So that is the picture of these inner earth dwellers who are advanced beings. And here's the Rourke expedition. And all of that takes us to the Nazis, and the Nazis were keenly interested in finding the artifacts of their, they sent trek to Tibet, 3 treks to Tibet, and they sent 2 treks to Antarctica. And so they were deeply involved in this inquiry. And some of that is, the Knight Templars were still active in Germany all the way through the 20th century. They directly descended. So when we heard about the Templars in France being executed, they didn't die, and you know the tradition stayed, and so they have this acquaintance with this secret treasures, this secret knowledge, this maps.
Well,
and if you
a lot
know,
of the people with the most direct lineage to the Templar tradition were shoved in the concentration camps. It was the offshoot ones that sort of the government could handle.
And the rich ones.
Yeah.
One of the things that happens with, even if you look at the Nazi, the cross is a Templar cross, and the Iron Cross, and on many of the Nazi ships and airplanes they have the cross, and that's an absolute derivative of the Templar cross. In plain sight, you know. So the Nazi expedition to Tibet, I didn't say a lot about it, but a German hunter biologist led 2 of the treks, and they ran around measuring people's heads and arms, and they were looking for this connection to the Aryan race, and they believed that there was a strong connection. And at some point they brought some people back, but it was more like it was a Mongolian tribe. It may not have been Tibetans, but they were trying to have this alliance with Asians, and that also was part of the Japan alliance for Germany in World War II. I'm not going to say much about that, but there's also in some of the lore a dark Shambhala warrior, and the Germans really love this. And we see this. This is Dorji Shugren, who is considered like, oh no, don't bring that up, and this dark force in Buddhism that the Dalai Lama had told people if they practice the Shugren, they're out. They're not longer doing Tibetan Buddhism anymore. They're doing something else, and it's really an issue. But this is, you know, you can see he's kind of a badass dude. He's not quite your holy man of peace. There turns out to have been an occult war. There's all this interest in occult and, you know, Theosophy and Anthroposophy and Steiner. Well, Steiner ends up being attacked viciously by the rising Thule Society and the Hitler interest, and they really try to hurt him. And nonetheless, here's pictures of the Nazi expedition, and they're wearing Tibetan clothes, and they're having bonfires, and they're carrying the Nazi flag. But there was one in 32, 34, 38. So there was a very deep interest in making connections with Tibet and finding this power that was hidden in the inner realms, the Shambhala force. And if it was like a nuclear weapon, all the better. This is the Kalmyks, who were Mongols, they were found in uniforms at the end of the war in some of the major cities. Most of them were on the front. They were using them as soldiers. It was pretty flagrant, you know. But there were also monks
Well, it was because the Soviets were shutting down the Buddhist temples, and so they were fighting with the Germans because they were reopening the temples for them.
Good point. Thank you. Sure. And Haushofer was the founder of the Thule Society, and that was the pathway for Hitler to come to power. There's another group called the Honoree, which was the ancestors. And this is a little track on the development of the swastika. And there were some pagan groups in World War I who embraced the swastika, and then as the Thule Society is forming in the 1920s, Hitler's joining them, and he rises to power. He adapts the swastika symbol. Seventendorf, who was one of the major figures in the Thule, he writes a book when Hitler comes to Chancellor, called Before Hitler Came, showing his debt to Thulism, and Hitler bans the book, and he kind of forces Sabatov out of Germany almost. But that fellow was no minor player. I guess I have a duplicate of that. The founder of the Honoree was Sven Hayden, and he was also someone who went on some of the Tibet treks and had a sincere, deeper encounter with them. He ended up founding what's called the Institute for Inter-Asia Expeditions. And then comes the Vril Society, and Vril is from a Sumerian word meaning like God, Vril. And the Vril Society comes out of a seance. What did I just do? Maybe it's between
back to the beginning.
these incredible, this group of 6 women who, the only thing I can think of to compare them to is like the Mary, the Mother of God, appearing to Joan of Arc. These women start channeling, and they are with the Thule people, and they start channeling a voice who's from Sumeria. This person gives them 2 texts. One of them is in the secret text of the Templars, which is known to Templars. And then the other one was a Sumerian text. Well, the Templar text was harder to translate, but the Sumerian text eventually gets translated, and it gets turned over. But this is these women. They were incredibly beautiful, and just unearthly in some ways. But they were revolting against the notion of the short-haired Bob in the 20s, and they felt that the long hair gave them spiritual power or psychic power. And I know when I cut my hair into the baldish, I felt it made me more psychically sensitive to have short hair, so these things. But they did that, and yeah, they were coiled up in interesting buns. And she's in a famous picture. She Maria Ostic in the center, and did much of the channeling. So that was their symbol, the Vril. And some of the text were giving them plans for saucers, flying saucers. They were giving them plans for anti-gravity. And so this launches the advanced weapon division of the Nazi Party. And these Thule people were very wealthy, and they're part of the industrialists. So they see these plans and they say, well, let's spend some money on this. So these are ships that were done, that were built. And this is before the war even. This was their symbol.
U.S. pilots apparently saw some of those and called them, nicknamed them Foo Fighters.
Right, exactly. And, well, I'm getting ahead now. We're going into Antarctica. This is the second part of the piece of this quest to go to Antarctica. The fellow who was a genius designer, Victor Schauberger, was an incredible engineer, and he took these plans and started building stuff. Later on, the Nazis sort of strong-armed him, and the Thule Society is separately sponsoring this research on these new flying machines. And Maria Ostick is wanting to, the source from, is wanting to go to Aldebaran, where these channeled messengers are saying they're from, and they're like these enlightened beings that we've all heard of in channeling lore. And so she wants to use the ships to go to Aldebaran and fly into space, but they're quickly weaponized by the Nazis, and so the Nazis use this information, and Victor ends up being at one of the camps directing the building of these saucers. But here's a picture, and there's the cross. There's some more pictures. This is one of, I think that was maybe a Foo Fighter there. It looks like our stealth planes right now. This is a Bell type, and here's this idea of anti-gravity with these two counter-rotating forces.
It's like developing a miniature hurricane, and the technology was loosely based on things that were talked about in occult science, the Theosophical understanding of the structure of an atom.
Exactly, and here he is with one of his sort of workshop items. So what happens is there's this secret space program that develops, and then that leads to an interest in getting to Antarctica, because it's believed that that's like the home of possibly the inner realms, possibly Antarctica, and possibly aliens that gave this information in the first place. But these are actual drawings. Some of this comes out of Russia, which has been like leaking stuff in the last 10, 20 years related to the Nazis to the West. And they have people in Europe have a much more open attitude about this. It's like, this is, oh yeah, oh yeah. And to us it's kind of really obscure and forbidden. So here's another picture of a spaceship. And this is the actual flag of the Nazi NASA for the Antarctic expeditions for the Nazis. That's their flag. What happens then is that at the end of the war with Project Paperclip, many of these scientists are transferred to America, and it's a little known fact, but the Nazis never officially signed a treaty or surrender at the end of World War II. Hitler passed the power to Admiral Dorn, who signs an agreement, and it's believed that within the last few hours, weeks, days of the war, that Hitler made it off in one of these ships to somewhere, and probably Argentina, which is the closest landing point to Antarctica. And that this work continued, the bases were continued. And the beauty of the submarines that the Nazis had was that they were able to go under these ice shelves and find this land, some of which was still, maybe still had old ancient sites on it, or they were just free to build. So that's what was generally presented. And this is I don't know if this picture is for real or not. I look at it and I see it a lot. If it was photoshopped, it's a fairly complex one. But like right here, I wonder. Because photoshopping is where you tightly cut a picture and superimpose it, either digitally or physically. And this is what happened at the beginning of the explorations in Antarctica. The Nazis sent out a crew and they marked some territory. Actually, they took photographs of the entire continent practically, and then dropped flags that were in essence claiming it. And then they claimed a lot of the Norwegian land, the Queen Maud land, and that made them at war. But that was part of why Norway was such embattled with Germany, was because of the Antarctic site. Admiral Karl Donitz, who signed the treaty, if you will, or who became president, the Führer when Hitler left, did say, and he was in charge of the Navy, said, "The German submarine fleet is proud of having built for the Führer in another part of the world a Shangri-La on land and an impregnable fortress." So this is referring to a statement of having made bases in Antarctica. And one of the big news items this year was that there was actual finding of a base that was abandoned. So it was proven. And this is a picture of our hero Rourke with one of these Chintamani boxes, and he carried this around for 5 years all through the United States and created this whole mystique about this precious jewel in there that was eventually put in the foundation of some building. There's this idea of the two paths related to Shambhala, which the Nazis embraced the dark one. This is about bases, New Schwabiland. Here's some of the officers of the Nazis. This is the ship New Schwabiland or Schwabiland. And then what happens at the end of the war is Admiral Byrd, who did fly over the South Pole, starts to say, those damn Nazis, they still have a base in Antarctica. We should go clean out that viper's nest. And Byrd is, a true American hero, if you will. He did everything right. He was from a Virginia family of Mayflower, lineage, and just a really good guy. And he flew over the North Pole, and then some people said he didn't, but he has a mystical encounter flying over the North Pole where he seems to have an encounter with the inner Earth. But he keeps it quiet. Like when he flies over the North Pole, all his instruments go crazy, and most people who have done that report similar things. And he does the first transatlantic flight. I mean, he's flying the same time that Republican Lindbergh was selling his baby to kidnappers. Did I say that on camera?
Yeah.
But yes.
It's almost 20 minutes.
Okay. So Byrd then does a flight over Antarctica and is there several times. And it's kind of like he's keeping up with the Nazis, like they know that they've got to have a presence there.
You mentioned what the Inner Earth government tells him in the purported diary that was left after his passing. Do you mention what they said in here?
Well, I have some of his diary stuff.
Well, the main thing is, if this diary could possibly be true, the Inner Earth government tells him specifically to contact all the governments of the outer world to tell them never ever to use nuclear technology
weapons,
in that manner, again, because apparently the dimensional physics causes a disruption on the fifth dimension when that happens on the third dimension.
I've seen some footage that talks about, even in the 60s, they were doing nuclear explosions at Antarctica. America was doing tests, and then it was Kennedy who signed the test ban treaty, but that they believed that there was one done and below the surface, way down. But anyway, so Byrd is the man to go and get the Nazis out of Antarctica. And so here's some pictures of him. This is an interview on television where he says some very significant things about what he saw in Antarctica. But when he's on this mission, he says he's flying over the South Pole and he finds an oasis, a land that is not covered with ice. And other people report that around the pole is not ice, and that's why we always see the black hole covering images of it. But in the basics of the expedition, there were 13 ships, 6 helicopters, 4,700 men, and other, women too, I imagine. They had a journey to the Ross Sea. They were supposed to be there for 6 months. They were there for 5 weeks, and there was one of the airplanes was destroyed and crashed, and 3 men died, they say. And they aborted the mission and came back early. And kind of like with very disturbing statements. So Byrd says in an interview, the cruel reality is that in case of a new war, the United States could be attacked by planes flying over one or both poles. And he said the fantastic speed with which the world is shrinking, I have to warn my compatriots that the time has ended when we were able to take refuge in our isolation and rely on the certainty that the distances, oceans, and the poles were a guarantee of safety. That he's saying something's there and that there was some kind of encounter. And kind of like what the astronaut Buzz Aldrin said, there's some evil here. And then, oh, I'm going to take it back. Well, after this was published in the Argentine paper, they pretty well shut him down. And these are men on the expedition. He writes in his diary, and it was hidden. It gets published in the 70s. There comes a time when the rationality of men must fade and one must accept the inevitability of truth. I'm not at liberty to disclose the documentation of this writing. Perhaps should never see the light of public scrutiny, but I must do my duty and record here for all to read. In a world of great greed and exploitation, mankind can no longer suppress what's not true. And the Russians have released a fair amount of information about that. There's footage that they released, because they were spying on us while this was happening, showing the birds, airplanes being assaulted by these saucers, and that they're coming at such speed that within minutes the plane was destroyed, and so it was a greater force, and so he backed down.
And footage of unnaturally lush green landscapes in the middle of, you know.
Okay, you guys, good night.
I'm sorry, good night.
Yeah, so the last piece is about some of the newest discoveries. And again, looking at something like this, it just opens so many more questions than we can have answers for. And some of that was eyewitnesses from the Russians. And the new visitors. So here we have the Prince and the King. China is making a big investment in Antarctica. Here's Get Your Ass to Mars. And he also tweeted before he left, I'm going to the launch pad. I mean, some people are saying that this business of what happened since World War II is that we've had for 50 years a space program. We've been going to the ends of the solar system and beyond. And that part of this is all based on Antarctica. And that Antarctica is this remote, hidden place where we've made deals with extraterrestrials who also have space there, who helped start the Nazis on this development. And that it's a whole different story than we've been told. But all of these people were there this year. Buzz Aldrin, the Russian patriarch, President Obama, and the CIA guy spending time there, Kerry and his little silver thing. So here's some strange finds that have been being found. Pyramids, unknown lakes, the KGB revealing information about the German U-boats and bases there, video coverage. 3 caverns inhabited by aliens was found. And I'm not going to say much about that. Here's more about the U-2 pilot saying he had an encounter with the inner Earth. So, I mean, there's 2 different stories going on here. There's this inner Earth story of these inhabitants, and then there's this quest to get to them and find them and use drills and to bomb the planet and to dig and drill and all of that. But, and you know, using our force and all of it. But these are this is the German base that was recently proved, where they found evidence, and there's more pictures, but these are German artifacts. And this was not on Antarctica, but one of the islands off of it. Other things they're finding are pre-Adamite bodies. It's been said that since 2006, these archaeologic sites have been found with some giant skeletons that are 12 15 feet large, and that the Smithsonian and all those people there have been crews there for years cleaning this stuff out, removing it, hiding the evidence. There's reports of 2 film crews that disappeared, and when one of them was rescued by some Navy pilots, they said they were just in shock. They were just dumbfounded and unable to speak when they took them out of the place that they were rescued from. But there's this business of flash frozen specimens, race of giants, mastodons, dinosaurs, 12 years removing 3 spaceships crash landed, and there's a theory of a Tiamat crash. This is a site that was just an object that was just found by someone using Google Earth, and it's been validated and it was released this year, but it looks like some sort of spacecraft under the ice. This is, to me, you know, I work with the JFK story, but JFK kind of works in, this is Fletcher Prouty, who was the Joint Chief of Staff and head of security for John Kennedy. Well, he was in Antarctica the day of the assassination. And he was, and at that point in time, it was like 36 hours away from an airplane. But he identifies Lansdale, that guy, and that guy, and that guy, and the hand, and that guy, and next to him, George Bush. So Prouty, he knew these people, he knew Lansdale, and Lansdale is the guy who found the Japanese gold treasure. These are some other sites.
The Bush family put serious investments into Germany during World War II.
Absolutely, right. And this is some sort of complex. They're calling it a castle. This is more. These are 2 openings that have been identified, and they're very big. They look like little tunnels, but they're large enough for an airplane. And they're from Google Earth people spotting them. This is this site here in a larger. This is also a site that's been found in an island off. And I spent a lot of time. There's some junk out there that's cartoon pictures that they say are, you know, sites, and you know. But this is also a questionable site. This is a stairway that's been found, and we don't have time to look at more than just glancing at it. But this is an orb, and this is a spaceship.
That's obviously Photoshopped now.
But this one comes up as being quite a referenced quite a bit. These are 2 different events.
I mean, it looks like it's shaped like some of the original technology, like that central apparatus that creates the artificial vortex and torus that creates the miniature hurricane that propels the craft from the center.
I'm going to keep going only because of but I appreciate your point, and you're right. It could be a Photoshop. This is a very interesting site that I don't know much about, and I keep seeing people talk about it. This is a site that is also on an island, and it looks like a metal thing, a metal gate.
I think that's still from Stargate SG-1. I can't tell, but I think it might be, because I remember an episode.
I've been looking at it and wondering if it's for real or not.
Yeah, it looks like it's from that episode.
This is some more stuff. This is a beautiful piece of ice, but they're saying this even can't be explained. Bulwer Lytton, a German writer, he wrote The Return of the Dark Race, the Vril, the Coming Race, rather. And we're talking about a hollow earth. Well, there's a picture of a hollow man. So anyway, my summary is that this year the Nazi presence is exposed. We're finding out about these underground bases, possibility of ruins from pre-Adamites, new theories about Earth's history in the last 15,000 years, possible site of Atlantis. It's changing our understanding of the planet, and some of the work that other people speculated, like Zecharia Sitchin, are being reconfirmed. But there's implications for the climate, for our sense of history, our identity, and it's like everything is changing with the information that's coming out of here. And we may
So
be.
much disinformation, it'll take centuries to piece any facts together.
This is a great image. I should have shown it earlier. This is a tunnel that was built by our technology in the 60s, and the whole planet right now is tunneled. So in addition, I mean, there's work on these caverns and caves that have existed for millennia, but every major city in the world has a cavern for Homeland Security to go to. And we have 5 major bunker governments if we were to have a war, and that was established during Reagan's era, and people in government periodically do a 4-day weekend to do games and practice. And one of them's in Denver, one of them's in DC, and one, I don't know where the other ones are, but this
There's
thing...
there's a whole
Yeah.
bunch of them in Mexico that are
Yeah.
under the earth.
And Japan has an elite city that's a mile square, where the wealthiest of the wealthy live underground. So and again, that's like in this Middle Earth realm that's trying to enter inner Earth through boring machines and through tunneling and such, but they're not really making the right
Okay,
egress.
hypothetically speaking, if there is a 5th dimensional Dyson sphere planet that's, you know,
Sure.
wouldn't there be tons of different civilizations just like ours with different political ideas, and they could be working with different people out here in different manners to maybe there's a whole other war going on beyond the...
Well, some people say we is the same model that we see going on the planet with a greed system and a banking system that is destructive of health, food, you know, education, money, transportation is going on a galactic or at least solar system, that there's an economy, a space economy. And it's running some of the same machine that we see running on Earth. And it's, you know, these banking interests, this heavily industrialized technology cells, and the other piece of it is slavery. Human and you know, other being enslavement, body parts, DNA, reproductive capacities are being, you know, part of the, on the table.
Yeah,
For barter.
If
That's
it's only
happening
a
a lot in
dimension next
China.
door, it would make sense that a lot of the intense differences that we find politically here, you'd find there as well in very similar manner.
It makes total sense. Well, I think it's we're past the time, and that's a great discussion. Thank you.
Really good.
And we could do our golden light.